Factors in the Ottomans' rise and Balkan conquests. The Ottomans emerged from a welter of small, independent Anatolian Islamic Turkish principalities that succeeded the Seljuk Empire following its defeat by the Mongols in 1243. Most of those states were founded by Turkic tribes previously pushed out of Central Asia into Seljuk territory by the Mongols. Each of them sought to emulate the Seljuks' former predominance, and all faced the political dilemma, common to nomad-based states, of reconciling nomadic traditions with settled, stable governing institutions. Failure to find a solution to that predicament was the bane of all previous nomad states. As the nomad states lacked professional standing forces, their essential military foundation was continually threatened by the transitory loyalty of rank-and-file warriors, who followed a particular leader only for as long as he was successful. Nomadic traditions of inheritance, which subscribed to equal division among male heirs, worked against a ruler passing on his territorial possessions whole and to a single successor. A frequent result was civil wars among sons that weakened or destroyed the state. Moreover, the nomad warrior lifestyle worked at odds with settled agrarian and urban pursuits that generated the fiscal and economic resources on which governments depended for stability and longevity. While the rulers of the 13th century Anatolian Turkish principalities primarily depended on nomad warriors for their military strength, they desired the benefits of controlling strong, settled, and organized states. Only the Ottomans ultimately succeeded. Ottoman origins probably lay in the nomadic Turkic Kayi tribe that entered Anatolia from Iran in the early 13th century and became allied with the Seljuks. Their tribal leader, traditionally identified as Ertugrul, was a Seljuk vassal and received a small piece of territory in northwestern Anatolia that abutted Byzantine lands. Although other Turkish principalities shared borders with Byzantium, only that of Emir Osman I, 1281–1324, the first truly historical Ottoman ruler, lay astride the main route to Europe, passing through Byzantium's most populous and richest Anatolian territories. Throughout his reign, Osman pursued unrelenting warfare against the Christians lying directly across his border. Islamic precepts combined with Turkic nomad warrior traditions and geography to make Osman's political situation unique. The concept of holy war, jihad in Arabic, Gaza in Turkish, was central to militant Islam. Many Muslim warriors considered it their sacred duty to expand Islam's worldly domain by force, buttressed by the promise that those who died in the effort received the immediate reward of everlasting paradise. A Turk warrior fighting in the name of holy war was called a Ghazi, but all nomad warriors, whether Ghazi or not, sought to enjoy the benefits, plunder and loot, of the militant lifestyle. With most of Anatolia held by Islamic principalities, holy war could be found only in the northwest fighting Christian Byzantium, and the possibilities for the richest fruits of combat could be found only in Byzantine possessions opposite Osman's small state. A swelling number of Anatolian warriors was attracted to Osman's standard, eager to fight for both religious glory and worldly rewards. His principality quickly acquired a multi- or non-tribal character, with loyalty to the House of Osman replacing strictly tribal allegiances. The House of Osman was a crucial factor in the rise of the Ottoman, Osmanli, state to preeminence among the Anatolian Turkish principalities. Beginning with Osman and ending with the death of Suleiman I the Magnificent, 1520–66, it enjoyed an unprecedented succession of 10 consecutive extraordinarily talented and successful rulers, sultans. No other contemporaneous Christian Balkan or Muslim West Asian state was blessed with such continuity of effective leadership. Under the House of Osman, traditional nomad attachment to successful commanders became institutionalized as dynastic loyalty, and nomadic mentality gave way to state stability. One important key to the Ottoman Sultan's success was their capitalization on the holy war concept, which provided them with a large, highly motivated military force as well as with a mass following of itinerant peasants and townspeople who flocked to their state from throughout Anatolia seeking new homes and lives in the rich lands captured from Byzantium. The Ottoman Principality quickly evolved into a large, heterogeneous, and dynamic frontier society, in which all inhabitants shared an amorphously eclectic lifestyle. Popular Islamic culture held sway in the Ottoman border state. Holy war was viewed as an absolute duty to be conducted continuously against non-believers. None of classical Islam's conditional restraints on defining true, holy war were given serious consideration. For Ottoman border society, Islam itself was more oral tradition and Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam, technically considered orthodox, than scholarly theology and accepted law schools. Most Ottomans, rulers and ruled alike, were connected in some way with interrelated networks of religious mystical orders, dervishes, urban fellowships, ahis, and craft guilds, esnafs, found throughout Anatolia. The early Ottoman rulers proved extremely adept at welding their diverse followers into a loyal, unified society. They succeeded because they themselves were full-fledged members of that society. Not only were they successful military commanders, they were ghazis themselves. They were members of mystical dervish orders, leaders of ahi fellowships, and closely tied to the trade guilds. Each ruler was trained in a particular craft until well into the imperial period of Ottoman history. Those institutions' networks provided the rulers with financial support, intelligence information, recruiting pools for additional followers, and sometimes fifth columnists within enemy states. Endowed with stout military and broad popular support, the early Ottoman rulers possessed unique tools for expanding their small border principality into an empire. To consolidate a stable principality, the Ottoman rulers needed a capital city to serve as a political and economic center. This was accomplished when Osman's son and successor Orhan captured Bursa from the Byzantines in 1326. Possessing a capital of his own, Orhan began acting the ruler in the accepted classical Islamic traditions of the Seljuks, building mosques, patronizing fellowships and guilds, and attracting Muslim scholars. Soon after Orhan took Bursa, the rest of Byzantine Anatolia fell into his hands, and the Ottoman state became a recognized leading power among the Anatolian Turkish principalities. By 1354 Orhan could stand on the Bosphorus shore of his lands and peer over at the towering walls and majestic domes of Constantinople on the opposite bank. His state had arrived at an important crossroads, both geographically and figuratively. He controlled the Anatolian access to the most important overland European-Asian trade routes, whose central terminus was the Byzantine capital. He also faced a choice regarding the future road for Ottoman state expansion, to move into Christian Europe or to continue on in Islamic West Asia. The fortuitous acquisition of Gallipoli on the European side of the Dardanelles Strait in 1354 settled the question in favor of continued holy war in the Balkans. A combination of factors accounted for the Ottomans' rapid and vast Balkan conquests. Once again, the Islamic holy war concept lent them a motivating morale that their European foes initially could not equal. Ottoman forces repeatedly overcame unfavorable battlefield odds to defeat their more numerous European enemies. The compact formations and lumbering shock tactics of the heavily armored Europeans were no match for the more lightly armored Ottoman nomadic horse archers, who relied on speed, fluidity, and deception in combat. Perhaps more important, the Turk warriors' commitment to both holy war and their Ottoman commanders consistently gave them the combat advantage in terms of morale and unity of command, which military experts regard as utterly crucial for battlefield success. Their European enemies, on the other hand, fielded armies composed of independent-minded nobles, whose eagerness to fight for their ruler depended on the perceived advantages to themselves such action might bring, and impressed, untrained peasants, who had little to gain by risking their lives, which made high combat morale and obedience to the commander's orders somewhat problematic on the battlefield. The armies of state alliances and crusades were usually hastily constructed from forces led by rulers jealous of their own positions and often in direct competition with one another, whose motives for united action were based either on personally threatening circumstances or on political and spiritual benefit. Such forces demonstrated little unity of command and battlefield cohesion. The Ottomans consistently won those campaigns that mattered. As the Ottomans' victories in the Balkans multiplied, increasing numbers of Anatolian warriors flocked to their ranks, and their territorial conquests grew. In the wake of the advancing armies arrived a steady stream of settlers from the Ottomans' cosmopolitan border society in Anatolia. Many came voluntarily, seeking new lives in a new land, settling in the cities and countrysides of the newly won territories. Some, such as the more nomadic pastoral tribes, termed Uraks, were colonized at the Sultan's orders in regions depopulated by decades of warfare or to secure and protect strategic lines of communication. As Ottoman territory in the Balkans expanded, the new arrivals provided both a ready recruitment pool for the larger army needed to serve on the borders and a demographic base to ensure firm Ottoman control. The sultans of the conquest proved to be master strategists and tacticians. They were open to advice from their subordinate commanders and knew how to delegate authority, with the assurance that their orders would be obeyed. The sultans learned lessons from their own successes and mistakes as well as from those of their adversaries, and they were pragmatic and willing to break with tradition whenever there was a practical reason for doing so, such as adopting early gunpowder weapons, especially artillery, over protests from subordinates that these were unclean and not in the tradition of classical Islamic warfare. The Ottoman rulers' skills also were manifest in the political sphere. Unlike their European Christian enemies, who were fragmented politically and at odds with one another, the Ottoman sultans enjoyed centralized authority that facilitated consistent political action. The state itself was their personal possession, in which their will was law, so long as it did not conflict with Islamic sacred law, the Shariat. To counteract the traditional nomadic Turkish system of shared inheritance and to guarantee that the state's unity would be preserved by orderly succession, the early sultans initially designated their eldest sons viceroys, viziers, and top military commanders, thus giving them first-hand leadership experience and the opportunity to win the warrior's allegiance. When, by the mid-15th century, that system proved disruptive, a system of fratricide was institutionalized. Upon a sultan's death, the son who received the allegiance of the key military, administrative, and religious leaders had all of his remaining brothers killed. The sultans of the conquest successfully broke the innate restraints of nomadic tradition on their authority by making use of institutions adapted from the Byzantines and Seljuks. To impose some measure of permanent control over their nomad warriors, they created a service nobility of sorts by granting tribal leaders and notables lucrative land grants for their support in territories won from the Christians. Those endowments, modeled extensively on the pronoia military grants of Byzantium, involved revenues extracted from parcels of land rather than ownership of the land itself. They were conditional upon the recipients fulfilling continued military obligations to the ruler. To further cement their independent authority, the sultans created an efficient administrative system to furnish a stable source of tax revenues. Initially staffed extensively by experienced Christian advisors from Byzantium and other Balkan states, the Ottoman central government became dominated by the sultan's personal household slaves, over whom the rulers held the power of life and death. Thus the Ottoman government became the most effectively centralized in all of Europe from the late 14th through mid-16th centuries and the envy of many rulers of Christian European states. Slaves also were key in the sultans creating their own military forces to augment, and counterbalance, the army's nomad warriors. Following Seljuk tradition, the Ottomans formed standing professional military units of janissaries, Yenişehri in Turkish, meaning new troops, from enslaved prisoners of war, who fell under their direct personal control and were separate from the traditional nomad warrior army. As the empire expanded in the Balkans, so too did the number of janissaries. Like the slave administrators, the janissaries were completely dependent on the will of their ruler masters, rendering them the most effective standing military force in Europe until the mid-16th century. Institutionalized slavery provided the Ottoman sultans with the means of breaking the limitations imposed on centralized state development by nomadic traditions through creating an invulnerable power base of their own. Slavery, combined with the sultan's alliances with dervish orders, ahi fellowships, and guilds scattered throughout their territories, formed the foundation on which they built their strong, centralized state. Also important in the Ottomans' rise was their rulers' mastery of diplomacy, coupled with their abilities to understand the inner workings of their enemies and to use that knowledge against them. Many of their Balkan conquests were accomplished through diplomatic, rather than violent, means. The sultans played the divided Balkan Christian states one against another through a series of temporary and shifting alliances, often sealed by deft political marriages with women from the ruling houses of their Christian opponents. Byzantine, Bulgarian, and Serbian spouses proliferated in the sultans' harems. The early sultans also realized that the Christian states were disunited internally by the growing institution of feudalism, which they came to understand, respect, and use to their advantage. The peaceful acquisition of troops and revenues was far more preferable in the sultan's eyes than their attainment by costly and disruptive warfare. Typically, the Ottomans threatened their enemies with violent military actions in hopes that their rulers would accept vassalage to the sultans, which entailed paying annual tribute and supplying military forces on demand. Only when such hopes proved unattainable, or when vassals reneged on their obligations, did the Ottomans resort to all-out warfare. Throughout the period of the conquest, Balkan Christian rulers commonly embraced Ottoman vassal status in an effort to preserve their positions and possessions. The fact that Byzantine, Bulgarian, Serbian, and Bosnian rulers all eventually attempted to break their vassal pledges ultimately resulted in their military defeat and the Ottomans' outright expropriation of their states. The sultans of the conquest also understood the religious divisions among their Christian enemies, between Orthodox and Roman Catholic and between mainstream Christians and heretics. For example, during their military operations against the Latins in Greece, Bosnia, and along the Adriatic, the Ottomans played to their own advantage on the Orthodox population's deep-seated distrust of Roman Catholicism following the Great Schism of 1054 and the Crusades. When Byzantine Emperor John VIII Palaiologos, 1425–48, agreed to reunite the Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches on papal terms at the Council of Florence in 1439, the Ottomans used the disaffection of the general Orthodox population in Byzantium to ease their way in conquering the Morea and the Byzantine capital of Constantinople itself. A final factor aiding the Ottoman conquest of the Balkans was the international situation in Europe during the mid-14th through mid-16th centuries. The Balkan Christian states were weak and divided, while disruptive conditions hampered effective concerted action on the part of Western European states. The arrival of the Ottomans in Europe coincided with the ravages of the Black Plague throughout the West, which crippled the Westerners' ability to respond to the Turkish threat. Moreover, Western Europe then was experiencing an era of intense political fragmentation that undercut its medieval order. The Avignon captivity, 1303–78, and the resulting Roman Catholic Great Schism, 1378–1418, undermined traditional papal authority. The Holy Roman Empire was transformed into a disunited federation of independent German states by the Golden Bull of 1356, and its Italian city-state possessions broke free of imperial control. France and England were locked in the Hundred Years' War, 1338–1453. Poland-Lithuania had its hands full with the Teutonic Knights and a rabid internal conflict between the king and the aristocracy. Only Venice and Hungary, which lay astride most of the Balkans' northern frontier, were in a position to oppose the Ottomans' advance. Venice, racked by plague and demographically small, could do little more than defend its scattered Balkan coastal and offshore possessions. The Hungarians earned lasting national glory by standing against the Turks and taking the lead in 3 Balkan Crusades, in 1396, 1444, and 1448. All 3 ended in defeat because of the lowered prestige of the papacy, which carried less weight in mobilizing Christian zeal for the fight, and the unwillingness of rulers in the larger Western states to participate, lest rival states prosper in their absence by attacking them at home. All told, Western Europe adopted a defensive posture regarding the Ottomans, effectively abandoning the Balkans to them until the 17th century. This was an excerpt from The Balkans, by Dennis Hupchick, 2002.